way that I met Peter Fischl was that I wrote an article in English Journal. And after the article was printed, Peter Fischl read it because it was about his good friend. And he was very moved by it. And he sent me a copy of his poem, To the Little Polish Boy. I had never read that poem before, and I didn't know Peter Fischl. And when I saw the poem and read the poem, I was really excited about it because it was something that I knew that would be really useful in the classroom. I teach 11th and 12th graders, I teach high school, and I teach English and creative writing, and I knew that this particular poem would be something ideal for all different types of teaching, actually. And I always do a Holocaust literature unit in my English classes, and I knew that this poem would be useful. So I started to teach his poem in my English classes. It went so well, the students were so moved by it, that later on I actually also teach it in my creative writing classes. I have 2 different kinds of lessons I teach with it. And I started corresponding with Peter Fischl. And he asked me, when I told him, I said, yes, I'm using your poem, it's really great, the students are very moved by it. He said, well, maybe you could, write up an article about how you teach the poem. And so that's how the article came into being. And I waited for a little while because I actually, I waited 3 years before I wrote it, because I don't write something about how to teach something unless I really, really teach it a lot. Because that way I know that any teacher, that it's tried and true, that, that all kids would really respond to it. So I actually did wait 2 years, and I taught it to a number of different kinds of classes. I taught it to a number of different types of students, and I taught it to a number of different venues. I even taught it in a temple. I taught it to teachers at workshops for Holocaust, and as well as public school classrooms. And this is a poem that really reaches people. It's a very, very moving poem of address. It's based on a photograph, a historic photograph of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. And there's this little boy standing at gunpoint being liquidated as the ghetto is being liquidated. And we don't know his name, and we sort of refer to him as the little Polish boy. So it's a very historic photograph. Some of my high school students have seen that photograph in their history books, and it's used quite a bit in literature about the Holocaust. So for some people, it's actually familiar. And I started to teach this poem, and I waited about 2 years. And then after about 2 years, English Journal put out a call for manuscripts. They wanted to do an issue on developing curriculums for peace. How do teachers teach tolerance? How do teachers teach peace in the classroom? So I thought that was a good opportunity to write the article. It did gear me to teaching it geared me to a different way of writing the article. I think this poem is so useful that if anybody's watching this video and wondering how to use the poem, you can use this poem in a poetry lesson, you can use this poem in a Holocaust lesson, you can use this poem in a history class, you can use this poem in an English class. I mean, it is very portable. You can use this poem in many different teaching situations. But for the English Journal and Curriculum of Peace, I felt that was ideal for the thrust of the way I basically used the poem. The poem that he wrote is called The Little Polish Boy, To the Little Polish Boy. And his words as a poet addresses the little Polish boy in the photograph. So the type of poetry that this is poetry of address. And it's a poem to an actual newspaper a photograph that was in some kind of publication. So art historians actually give this type of poetry a special name. It's called ekphrastic poetry. It's a very esoteric name. What is really exciting about this poem is that I think it gets kids to empathize with a very abstract subject. And the abstract subject is the Holocaust and 6 million or 11 million people, 6 million Jews that were killed. And it's too abstract for, it doesn't put a face on the history of it. And this particular poem particularizes one boy's point of view and one poet's point of view, and enables, I think, the reader and the viewer to enter the experience poetically, visually, And I think it's a great lesson. I told my history friends, my history teacher friends, I said, I think you should start teaching the Holocaust and the history of it through something like this, because it puts a face on it for kids. There's just not a page in a history book. But I teach it in an English class, and I teach it as part of a Holocaust literature unit in English class, and I think it's a great introduction to putting a face on the literature. Immediately, when the kids read this poem, I read it to them, and then I ask them to write their own poem of address to either the little boy or to any other subject in the photograph. And these are not kids that have any experience writing poetry, and they're not kids that have, are necessarily the gifted or honor students. And all the students, without any trouble at all, are able to express in words something to one of the subjects. Sometimes they write to the soldier, sometimes they write to the mother, sometimes they write to the other kids in the photograph. And it's very moving poetry. But my objective is not just poetry. My objective is that they somehow imaginatively enter the experience, imagine what the little boy might be thinking, imagine what the women might be thinking, imagine what the soldier might be thinking. And then we share the poems. And that's basically our introduction to Holocaust literature. Then I actually often teach Life from the Yellow Star, the other book and the other article, and we go into Elie Wiesel's Night very often, and we go into other Holocaust pieces that we read. But I usually use Peter's poem as an introduction. So it's a great, in the teacher jargon world, anticipatory set, something that gets the kids in the mood, kind of gets them focused. And then I actually tell the kids, I give them a follow-up poetry assignment, which is, I tell them the story of how Peter wrote that poem, which is a whole other story. And it's an amazing story of how Peter wrote that poem, which is part of my article. So I tell them that I know the poet and that he was a Holocaust survivor. And I tell them that he wrote the poem because he was living in Burbank, California in the early 60s and just happened to see that photograph in Life magazine at least 2 decades after the fact, and how he had been living a very isolated, normal, mainstream American life and kind of trying to forget the Holocaust and forget his past. And then when he saw that picture, it kind of brought it up to him. And he wrote the poem. But I tell my students, Peter Fischl's not a poet. He's not a published poet. Poetry is not, his thing. But he was so moved, he just had to write a poem. And my poetry writing assignment for the kids I ask them to search for a picture that moved them as much as the little Polish boy picture moved Peter Fischl. So it could be a photograph, or it could be a newspaper picture, or it could be a family picture, or it could be a piece of artwork. But something has to blow them away the way the little Polish boy photograph blew Peter Fischl away. And I tell them, it's going to take a while for you to find that. You can't just walk into it. So it's a long-range assignment. I give them about a month to find something that moved them as much as the little Polish boy moved Peter Fischl, and then they write their own poem. And sometimes the poems are amazingly inspired. They're not all necessarily political, but a lot of the kids do political poems. I mean, they pick old civil rights photographs, and I had a Vietnamese girl that picked up that very famous historic photojournalism of the napalmed little girl, which was kind of amazing. Some kids pick family photographs, but it kind of gets them into poetry as well, because we're a literature class. And the whole idea of this type of poetry is a kind of dual lesson. So I teach the Holocaust, but I also teach how to enter other people's experience, and I think ultimately it's a lesson in empathy, and that's what the article's about. Teaching empathy as a means for developing tolerance and a curriculum for peace. And so it was published in the English Journal in the year 2000. And if anybody's wants to read the article, it will give you a more detailed lesson plan of step 1, step 2, step 3 on how to teach the poem and what to say first, second, and third, and follow-up lesson. And basically, that's what I do.
Well, you've answered every question I had planned. So that's perfect. Absolutely. You sound like you're a great teacher, by the way. Morristown must be a great school district and all that. I mean, I'm guessing just off the record. That being said, you touched on something, and it's something that I sort of mentioned in the summary of what we're trying to do with this documentary, is that Peter, you know, I'm guessing he would have had a very privileged upbringing. He did up until the time his father was killed, and he went into hiding and then had to flee. So I don't think he's been formally educated in terms of English or poetry or anything like that. He was in fact a printer for most of his life.
Right.
And I like to equate the fact that here's a guy who printed a bunch of material before, and then he was inspired to do this one poem. And you've given it the official name, whatever. What is it called?
Ekphrastic.
That's writing a poem to
a great work of art.
work of art.
Yeah.
How would you characterize the poem in terms of literature, in terms of technique?
Well,
and you know, you don't want to disparage it, but here's a very personal thing that someone has written. How would you characterize it?
Well, the interesting thing is that Peter didn't know that his poem actually kind of fell into a literary tradition. I mean, he just wrote his poem, which is what great poets do. You know, great poets write from the heart. They write from their experience, and it's real. And you know, Peter's poem is real. It's from his heart. It's from his experience. No one can read that poem without being deeply moved by it. He didn't say to himself, as sometimes kids in school have to do when they get assignments to write poetry, I have to write a sonnet, you know, or I have. So his poem is a real gift. It's what poetry is really about. It's his authentic voice. You almost, when you read the poem, you can hear his voice. You know, you can hear that there's sort of an accent to it, you know, a sort of a syntax to it that's his own. And I mean, it's everything that I think as a poetry teacher I would want a poem to be. It's understated, it's genuine, it's very what we call accessible. I mean, Peter doesn't want to write a poem that only the highbrow can read. You know, his poem is there for everybody to read and to, you know, to engage in. But he didn't know until, you know, I read it and spoke to him, he didn't know that it actually was in a literary tradition, which great poets are always writing in their culture or in a literary tradition, because you can't help but being influenced. And the poem that he wrote is a poem in response to a great work of art, or in the modern times, a photograph. And this type of poetry has been around for thousands of years. The Greeks, you know, would look at decorations on vases and, you know, address them. Poems of address are a long tradition. It's an oral tradition. And great poets do write this type of poetry. So I think it kind of pleased Peter to know that the poem itself is in a literary tradition and is very teachable because of that. I mean, when I first read it, I went crazy because I went, oh my goodness, this is an ekphrastic poem on top of everything else. It's a Holocaust poem, but it's also an ekphrastic poem, you know. So I said, wow, I mean, I can teach this in a million classes. I do teach it in creative writing, not because I'm teaching the Holocaust, but I'm teaching ekphrastic poetry and poems of address. So I do teach it in, you know, to poetry students. And any student or anybody that reads that poem is going to feel that they can write their own, which I think is the purpose of poetry. I don't believe in poetry being for a select few, and I think the great thing about poetry is that someone can, that it's a gift to share to someone else, and that gift gets shared to someone else, and that gift gets shared to someone else. And that's what Peter's poem is doing, because when kids read it, they write their own poems. And that's what I think most poets would really love to know. They would like to know that someone reads their poem and is inspired to write their own poem. So I think Peter's poem is a great poem.